Hello, welcome to Time to Say Goodbye. It is the 21st of August, and I don't know. The only thing I think that will have happened from the time we were recording and the time you hear this is that some other people will have given speeches at the DNC. I don't know who is up. Who is up tonight?
I
Do
have
you
no
guys know?
clue.
No,
No.
is it okay? I don't know either. But last night was Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and AOC, right?
And Sean Fain. Yeah.
And Sean Fain. So to talk about not just this, but to talk about sort of the future of the left, which is something I personally have been thinking about a lot personally. We have on Matt Karp. I think you've read a lot of, if you've listened to this podcast, I imagine you've read some stuff that Matt has uh, written in the past, but we always give an opportunity here for people to, I don't know, we try and dispense with the lengthy bios. But Matt, is there anything that you want to tell people, like any sort of plug or something like that something like that, where they can sort of get to know you a little bit better?
I think it's Obama night tonight at the DNC.
Oh, okay.
I think
That
that's
voice you hear is Matt.
and tomorrow is sorry. Hi Jay. Hi Tyler. Thanks for having me on. Yeah,
Right
I
on.
teach history at at Princeton. I write about the Civil War era, and I've also written a lot for Jacobin, and now I'm doing a writing thing for Harper's. I don't know what else.
No,
Oh,
that's good.
I
That's
should pump my little think tank or semi-regular Zoom meeting called with the grand title, the Center for Working Class Politics, which has actually done some pretty interesting work, I think, on
Oh, right on.
just data, just essentially sort of survey experiments with working class voters. So we can talk about that if we want later. That's more in the weeds.
Tyler's here too, but I don't know, Matt. Did you watch the DNC at all last night? What'd you think?
Yeah, I thought I wouldn't. But then I realized it was a sort of lefty night. You know, it was a sort of lefty undercard plus Hillary. It was a Hillary and Biden. It was an interesting decision where you put all your star performers
Yeah,
on the
yeah, yeah.
first night. But so I did. I didn't actually see Sean Fain, which sounds like it was probably the sort of actual lefty highlight. I saw a little bit of AOC. I saw Hillary. I saw a few others.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Tyler, what'd you think?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was really notable, like Matt said, that the first night was so relatively jam packed with people with more left wing bona fides. I liked, like most people, I liked AOC's speech a lot. I mean, I think she's immensely talented, and Fain. I mean, it was great to see, So I do think it, at least symbolically, seems to signify a positive trend within the Democratic Party. I mean, how much faith we should put into that, I think, is an open question we'll probably talk about. But yeah, I mean, I was impressed with AOC, but I'm OC defender, so I expected to be impressed by her.
It's hard to know what to make of some of these things, right? Because it's the type of thing that I think we in the punditry, not YouTube, but at least for me, where when you're writing a weekly column or something like that, Matt, you write quite regularly too. So I'm sure you think about it, you're just like, well, how much should I actually make of this? Like, are they launching her? Like, what?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
is the DNC saying, oh, well, we want to give AOC 7 minutes because it's meaningful and she's the future of the party? And that's the type of thing that I think a type of political journalist would say. And I think it's probably true. Otherwise, they wouldn't have her speak, right? But it is hard to know whether or not we should think about this as a projection forward of AOC and what that means. I'm sure that everybody is theorizing about it a lot today, but I don't know. I think more than anything, it was just that it seemed like there's a lot of excitement about her, which I don't know. I guess I didn't expect that level of excitement. But then again, I think that the people were so pumped up at the DNC that they were going to be excited about anybody who went up there. I mean, the energy was, it got to hand it to, is quite electric there.
I
Yeah.
think that's true to an extent, but it's also true that she's a celebrity, and I from in my hour and a half of viewing, I mean, for one, I don't know how much the 7 minutes means. I mean, they gave Jasmine Crockett,
Right.
Texas congressman, like more time, even. Are they launching her? Like, what is there's a lot of Democrats speaking for a long, long time. Even the primetime slots are really big. At the same time, I do think that the audience, if whatever it means, the Democratic National Committee delegate audience, the only speaker who had such an electric response was Hillary. It was, I mean, and it's probably not a coincidence that these are two of the most famous people who spoke, at least until Biden. And I do think that there's just like a celebrity factor. And yeah, there's a raw talent factor because she just does have charisma on stage. There's no question about it. But I wouldn't read personally too much into, this representing a deep ideological shift. I mean, you also noticed AOC for her part. I also broadly like the speech, and I'm not anti AOC in some programmatic way, but you saw she was clearly also playing to the DNC audience. Like she didn't, she based the only time she mentioned the Gaza stuff was to congratulate Kamala for working tirelessly for a ceasefire, which is, at least from my perspective, pretty disingenuous. So it was a tactical speech by AOC too, for sure.
Yeah, let's just talk about that right now then. Tyler, I didn't mean to cut you off, but
no, I was just going to say, I mean, one of the things that was striking about it was less the audience applause as much as like the right-wing discourse about it on Twitter, where you had like a lot of prominent right-wing people being like, that was actually a really good speech, and like we're concerned about it, and so in some ways I think that reaction is also really interesting, lacquered on top of all of this as well, because I do think she is, I think people correctly across the board recognize her formidable talent, and whether she'll apply that to, normie Dem politics or something more left-leaning is an open question. But sorry, Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should just talk about that and get it out of the way, which is that, you have this moment with AOC and you have this ongoing criticism. I don't think that it's new. It certainly has been going on basically since she was elected, where I don't think purity tested is the right word because it's too intense, right? But there is a constant fear that this beautiful, amazing person that was such a huge victory for the left to be elected is going to sell us all out, right?
Mhm.
That she's going to, and that every single thing that she does is scrutinized in a way, not just by the right or the center of the party, but really the people to the left, like DSA or whatever. And that, certainly there's a narrative that one can tell that of the last 6 months or so where AOC supports, kind of makes a break with Bernie in terms of, whether or not Biden should step down. Definitely breaks with Bernie when it's announced that Kamala is going to be the nominee, where like Bernie was much more grumpy about it and certainly was much more, critical, or at least withheld his support of Kamala for a little bit at least. And that AOC, because she did all of that and because it's seen that she's somewhat becoming more moderate and distancing herself in some ways from the rest of the squad, which, half of which is gone at this point, right? Like Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman are both gone. That she's running towards the center and that she's not going to be the left politician that we want, but that perhaps she's going to be sort of like a progressive leaning normie Dem in the way that Pramila Jayapal is right now, right? Like Matt, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I would frame it maybe less in terms of a pure sort of left-right spectrum or left-center spectrum, and maybe also less, and definitely less in terms of the sort of Biden Kamala debate, which really had all developed, out of which came all sorts of screwy and unpredictable, and I think probably pretty evanescent kind of alliances that are not super material, but were kind of particular to that moment. But what I would say is striking about AOC as in comparison to Bernie, I mean, and I think I was tweeting about this morning, but is that she really in this instance, yes, represented a sort of a more conciliatory rather than an oppositional relationship with the Dem establishment. It doesn't necessarily mean that she's moving to the center in her own views or in her own politics, but in terms of her kind of attitude and relationship with the Democratic leadership. Yes, Bernie, of course, always after his defeats in the primary got on board, but it was always grudging, and he always maintained his kind of grumpy independence from the party. And when he spoke, he was given convention seats, and he always sort of said, no, we need to unite to defeat the Republicans. But you never had a sense that he was kind of joining the team that he was, and he never actually got the welcome from the team in that sense. Everyone, sometimes people, online would use Bernie's endorsement to sort of berate various lefty bad actors. Like, Bernie's a grown up. He knows we need to vote Democrat, blah, blah, blah. But no one actually regarded him as this sort of, as a sort of a member of this united Democratic, vanguard. I mean, yes, he did get committee chairmanships and he got some power with Biden. It's not that they neglected him and marginalized him entirely, but there was clearly, to me, some affective and substantive antagonism that persisted throughout Bernie's kind of career as a national leader, and there still would be tension there. Whereas I do feel like AOC has made a decision to, or at least that's the way that her speech was pivoted, but maybe more broadly, to kind of really genuinely work with the party and in and through the party in a different way. And not really highlight points of opposition or tension or wedge issues where, she represents a sort of a different faction than the rest of the progressive Democrats. So, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see the sort of squad talk kind of winding down to some extent going forward.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're moving to the center, but it is a different sort of tactical approach for sure.
Yeah, Tyler, what do you think?
Yeah, I kind of feel about AOC kind of like I feel about Jacobin, which is that, Jacobin and AOC both can get like a lot of shit from the left, I think, or certain corners of the left, whenever they do something, people disagree with. But I'm just always come from a place of thinking it's awesome that we have a glossy magazine that people actually read that disseminate left-wing ideas. And that's kind of how I feel about AOC, which is that, like, yeah, I think she's has leaned into the Dem establishment more than Bernie, and maybe she's really clearly made her bed with electoral politics, and that being the play for the left. And I think there's, reasonable things about that and bad things about that. But I do think, I guess it is not lost on me that we have, a popular socialist candidate in office, or, I think that means something. And I think,
Do you think she would still describe herself as a socialist?
I don't know. I think that's a good question, but she's still, I mean, the DSA parts of the DSA have been kind of hostile to her, but she's remained, nonetheless,
right, but outside of
keeping
DSA politics, like,
yeah,
yeah,
I mean, I think so. I've never heard her say she changed her mind or like move
right.
away from those views in any firm rhetorical way. I mean, I think she has a strong sense of when to emphasize them and when not to, But yeah, I mean, I think she clearly represents the, making peace with electoral politics wing of the left. And I think, you can think that's misguided or not, but she does seem to be, at least strategically, have found herself in, kind of proximity to power in ways that other, figures have not in the same sort of way. But I don't know. What do you think, Jay? I don't have a good read on your AOC temperature.
I like AOC a lot, but I think it's for a bunch of reasons that I think is a good segue to Matt, what you wrote about in Harper's. This is I believe it's your column, right? That you write regularly for.
Yeah, I'm just every other month or so.
Right.
Nice.
And the article is called Blank Ballad, and it's I don't know, I think it was a very thoughtful and interesting meditation on what's happening with the left right now. And these larger questions that exist on, like, does it still exist or not? Like, was Adolph Reed Jr. right when he was like, this is all dead now, right? Like, he wrote that, I think, in Harper's, right? Is that where he wrote it?
That was a cover story 10 years ago, but that was pre-Bernie.
Right. And that we have this sort of constant theorizing about, well, where do we go after Bernie now? Like, that's sort of where it's at. And what is the actual strength of this intellectual movement, for example, that was created? What is the strength of the media movement and the content movement that was created? What do they do? And then all these elected officials that got swept, local officials, a lot of them, right, that won their elections, like, what happens to them? And then, at the center of this was all AOC as being this bright beacon. And I think that one of the questions that we had was just basic, that have centered around her the entire time is, well, does the left actually want a Nancy Pelosi for progressive ideas, right? Like, do we want an operator that is going to care about vote counts and is going to care about, whipping up the party and has a certain caucus under her control? Like, do we want that on the left, or is that something that we don't want? Do we want to see ourselves as an oppositional party, and our elected officials, we want them to behave or function much more like Rashida Tlaib, right? Like, we want to have a figure that puts up, that holds up a sign when Netanyahu is speaking, right? Do we want that? Like, is that the heroic figure that we want? And I don't think that answer has a really clear, I don't think that question has a very clear answer, right? But to me, I think that the thing I've been most impressed by is just how she has actually been able to try to do it, right? Like, she's clearly trying to go with the first option. It's really hard because, like, nobody actually wants you to do it. The left doesn't want you to do it, right? The right certainly doesn't want you to do it, and the people of your own party definitely don't want you to do it. And so for her to go for it is interesting to me. And Matt, I think like what you said, what it actually is a reflection of is her celebrity power, that she actually can do it, right? If
Yeah.
she was not this huge celebrity politician, then she would have just been primaried out of there at this point, or she would be marginalized to the point where it wouldn't matter. But she's a huge celebrity, and this is what she's deciding to do with it. I think it's an interesting, I don't know, I think it's an interesting question to have. Will it ultimately be corrupting in ways that make it untenable for her to be identified with any of the politics that we might agree with? Possibly, right? But I don't know. I think it's like a worthy experiment. But Matt, to this piece you wrote, it focuses on this day that I think about all the time, right? Which is the day of the Nevada primary in 2020. And you say, you sort of characterize it as the last great day of hope that we had. I remember it. I remember basically that entire day just because I was so happy. I really felt like it was going to actually change, and that things were going to, that we had pulled off this incredible act of mobilization in Nevada, and that against all odds we had done this thing, and that everything else would fall in place, right? Like it didn't matter. And then you point out what happened, right? Which is that Pete Buttigieg basically just immediately drops out of the race. There's this grand consolidation, and they do what they did to Bernie. And then you write, in retrospect, March 2020 marked not only the end of the Sanders campaign, but also the closing act of a long decade of international struggle. On both sides of the Atlantic, the 2008 recession unleashed fitful waves of discontent that eventually cohered into left-wing movements of a recognizably populist stripe. In Greece, where Syriza led the fight against European Union austerity. In Spain, where the Podemos, led by an improbably ponytailed political scientist, surged to the top of the polls. In France, where Jean-Luc Mélenchon's brand new movement emerged as the strongest force on the left. And in Britain, where the lifelong backbencher Jeremy Corbyn, flanked by a brigade of young socialists, suddenly took the helm of the Labour Party, right? And then you sort of give a sense of where that is right now. Can you just tell the listeners where you think we are right now from that moment?
Well, they're all out of power, right? None of them won. I guess Mélenchon most recently. This is the danger of writing a column, 2 months before it goes into press, because actually Mélenchon has had another lease on life a little bit through this French election, in which his Popular Front did better than expected. Although I think he's still quite a long way away from actually, real legislative power in France. But yeah, broadly, it's a story of defeat. I mean, there was this sort of international left populist movement that you could put Bernie in context with, and like Bernie, they all emerged in different waves, probably in response to in some ways a delayed response, but I think still a concretely connected response to the financial crisis and the recession of 2008 and after, coming out of Occupy in the United States, for instance, obviously. And then they really, kind of crested in the mid 2010s, the teens. And then in the 2020s, they've all either been snuffed out or transformed. In the UK, it's the sort of most extreme example of being just sledgehammered into pieces, and being replaced with a kind of a new center-left regime, and where the sort of organized labor left has barely an existence right now. Every story is different. I mean, I think that's really just context for most of the piece, which is actually about the U.S. left, which is the only thing I'm really even half qualified to talk about. Because I think, other people could come in and tell you about what happened to Podemos, or whatever. But I think, to me, the Nevada caucus that you evoke was also just a kind of one of the strangest nights that I've ever had in American politics. This incredibly unusual feeling of winning, and winning in what's felt like a meaningful way against long odds that would set up a real significant and kind of higher stakes struggle to come. And it was so incredible how that was just completely kneecapped with the sort of almost the speed and the dramatic intensity you'd expect from a prestige TV show where, one character's on the top of the world and then gets toppled in the next week's episode, because it was so quick that on Super Tuesday, Bernie just got hammered by this consolidated Obama-led unity around Biden. And it revealed also, I think, ultimately, as I wrote at the time, and I still believe, that Bernie actually wasn't really ready. The Bernie coalition wasn't big enough to win. It wasn't just Machiavellian machinations that sort of stole something. It wasn't electoral fraud or establishment, malfeasance. It was also that the coalition wasn't big enough. But I guess what's happened, and that's not a crime or a sin. But I guess what the real bulk of the column is about, and the reason why it's a sort of a melancholic column and stands in some contrast to the sort of kind of peppy, optimistic, progressive energy right now. But I'm still sort of mired in some of this melancholy, because I think what Bernie represented is not just a more oppositional relationship with the sort of Democratic establishment. That's one element tactically that we could contrast him and AOC. But he also represented an effort to build a coalition that was fundamentally different from the direction that today's Democratic and today's progressive coalitions are built on. It was an attempt to sort of, it was a reason why he kept going to West Virginia and going on Fox News. There's a reason why he won working class voters in states like Michigan and Nevada. There was a reason why he was expanding the map. At least he was trying to, more in 16 than in 20, I think. But he was really trying to fight against this massive defining phenomenon of the last half century of kind of industrialized post-industrial politics, which is working class voters moving to the center and to the right, leaving parties of the left and the left center. And he was trying to do it by fusing populist progressive economic politics and ideas, Medicare for all, et cetera, student, free college, with critiques of corporate America, in a way that said, okay, we're going to take the money from the millionaires essentially and give it to you. And it seemed like he was making some traction in whatever improbable way that this like old Brooklyn Jewish guy from Ben and Jerry's Vermont was actually going to appeal to sort of, deindustrialized, former auto workers in Rust Belt, Michigan, or, kind of new working class, racially diverse, younger casino workers in Nevada, et cetera,
Right.
against all of these other institutional forces that hated Bernie within the Democratic Party and were trying to oppose him. And it just seemed like he was expanding, not just that he was training his guns on the Hillary Clinton establishment, but he was actually building from the ground up, or at least he was displaying a politics that could win from the ground up. And what I worry is, even with all the momentum internally that, if you will, AOC style or progressive caucus style politics has made within the Democratic Party, in terms of, a few narrow, I would characterize them as relatively narrow, others would say large, policy wins in the Biden administration, you have seen zero evidence that this newer form, this post-Bernie form of left electoral politics, can actually expand the map, can win outside of places like, the sort of the gentrifying neighborhoods in Queens that elected AOC. And I know that's not to say that there aren't working class voters who vote for the squad. I know there are, but we haven't seen any squad members win in outside of a very particular kind of urban neighborhood, which is not representative of the country, and also can't really build power. Jay, to your distinction between building power or speaking truth to power,
Right.
I think the reason why I was so interested in Bernie, I had never been a leftist, to be super biographical, and I know this is a bit of a monologue, but I'd never been a leftist in 30 years of thinking about American politics. I always was repelled by that left-wing impulse to speak truth to power instead of trying to attain and use power. And I felt like Bernie was actually a real break with the left that I had known in the 90s and the early 2000s, which was just rejecting everything and not building anything. Whereas, and what I worry now is that we have a different kind of, it's neither the rejectionist left of the sort of late 90s or so on, but that's just wants to sort of burn flags or whatever. But nor is it the sort of the Bernie left that wants to actually build power by winning popular support outside of an already existing progressive base. And I worry that the horizon for this kind of newer progressive politics, this post-Bernie politics, is really much lower and much weaker than what that brief moment seemed to reveal in Nevada in 2020. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Tyler, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you articulated that really well. I mean, I think there is this kind of, I think you're right that Bernie represented a break from that kind of, burn it down, flag burning, rejectionist left. I think that's a good way to put it. And I think if there's a problem with the sort of AOC moment is that it's too accommodating to the Democratic Party when, part of what Bernie represented, and I think what people are frustrated with is just the status quo in the sense that everything is fine, and I think the Democratic Party is institutionally the party of everything is fine, or everything was fine before Trump. And we just need to get back to that halcyon, multicultural managerial class golden era of Barack Obama, and then everything will be okay again, And so I do think and that's one of the many issues I have with the sort of Democrat line about sort of we have to defend our institutions and we have to claw back the right word anti-democratic forces on the right, and not that I disagree with any of that, but I do think there's as a message there's a lot of frustration with precisely that status quo, and so defending sort of our democratic institutions at a time when people don't feel like they're working for them seems to me to be a losing message. And I think Bernie was really good about articulating that, and I think I worry a bit about AOC being too accommodating to that kind of politics. But you also, raise a really good point in your piece, which is that you said, or maybe it was on Twitter, there's this question of whether or not Harris's policies are populist, and whether we're having a kind of resurgent populism with Biden and among Democrats. And you pointed out that like a crucial tenet of populism is naming an elite that we're working against, right? And that there does seem to be this, like, what Bernie did was say, like, this is the 1%, and this is corporate America, and this is Wall Street, and that we can name the people who are doing this to us, and there is a sense in which that's been kind of neutered and watered down. And this, there's a lot of talk about the middle class, so on and so forth, but there's like not really a lot of willingness to reckon with the sort of economic elite, which includes people in the, Democratic donor class, et cetera. So yeah, no, I think the way you've articulated this post Bernie moment is right.
She had her moment last night where she said Donald Trump would steal a dollar from, or rob a dollar, and
that's a good line.
Her pockets and her friends on his friends on Wall Street.
But that's just it, Jay, because it's kind of like Donald Trump's friends on Wall Street. What about Kamala Harris?
No, I agree. I agree. It was not an Occupy, inspired message for sure. I'm just saying that, in that moment she did do that. I don't know. I guess Matt, I understand where you're coming from on all of this. I would characterize the economic policy wins as larger than you would, I think, and I do think that it was meaningful to have, for example, Inflation Reduction Act, which is something that you mentioned in the column, or I think it was meaningful to have somebody on the left in the, Lena Khan position. Mm-hmm. And I don't think so far that, even though I would like to be an alarmist about all this stuff, I don't see that much actual evidence that Kamala is going to tack too far to the right. Like this fear that she's going to just sort of sell out everything for the donor group, the two reads, right? Like I don't see much evidence of that so far, even though I think that it's something I certainly was worried about. But yes, in terms of an oppositional politics, this is not it, right? This is a sort of amended Biden message mixed with a lot of vagueness, and then some anti-Trump stuff, but not clearly as anti-Trump as Biden. One of the things that struck me last night was like all the people, of course, just played the hits, right? Like, I mean, Hillary's speech was legitimately her speech from 2016. It was like, we're going to break the glass. You're going to stand next to me, all these girls. We're going to smash the glass ceiling together. She even said it takes a village. It really was like, it was like watching a band like do a medley of all their hits on the Grammys, because they have like 4 minutes to do it. And I would say, like, I think that she did a good job delivering the medley of the hits, but it was, it was still her thing. What Biden did, I was surprised he just still went back and talked about like Charlottesville, right? Like that was his big thing, where he just said, after Charlottesville, I saw the country was going to fall back into darkness, and I decided to do something about it. And I said, I have to run against, these neo-Nazis and these fascists. And that's not a message I've seen so much from the Harris campaign either. It's been a little bit strange to try and to try and figure it out. It's like, we're about joy, we're about freedom. That's basically it, right? We're joy, we're freedom. Like freedom is Kamala and Tim Walz's joy. And they're like if you think about it as like a you know, a Pixar film, right? Like Inside Out, right?
Yeah.
There's joy, freedom, and then like Trump shows up and he's like angry fascism or something like that, and they have to like figure out a way to defeat him. But I don't know. I don't think it's. I agree it's not oppositional, but I do think that there is a thing where sometimes I think, Matt, like we have to like recognize wins when we have them, right? And that if we are going to engage in electoral politics, that we need to be a little bit like we're never going to get the wins that look the way that we want them to look, but that we should still like recognize some of them as wins. So I that would be the one place where I would disagree with you. I do think some of the policy gains were actually quite significant.
That's fair, and you can pile up the sort of things that I might say are smallish, and maybe you add them up and they're not so small. The NLRB stuff, yeah,
Right.
like it's true about Khan, the trade stuff, the monopoly stuff, the spending bills. I guess I just felt that I just wonder what is the policy legacy of the Biden administration? Like when people 3 years from now or whatever say, oh yeah, the Biden. So I mean, are people, if you work at a chip factory, then there you go. There's your legacy. But if you don't,
Right.
if you're one of the
Yeah.
99.5% of people who don't and don't know anyone who does, then it feels to me like a lot of the legislation, at least this is different from the regulatory stuff, but the legislate, which was I think genuinely good and does reflect some element of left wing pressure, the fact that some of those appointees got made and stuff, but the legislative stuff, it feels a little like sand through a sieve. Like we saw this with the child tax credit, where it's like, you know, oh, once it goes in, it's never coming out. But actually, it just went right through, and now we might do it again. But it's not creating a constituency. It's not even Obamacare. And this is where I have this weird position, because I know there were all these recent arguments online about Obama versus Biden, blah, blah, blah. And they were mostly characterized as sort of the liberal left Biden apologists versus the sort of more center liberal Obama people.
Right.
But in a
John
funny,
Chait. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But in a funny way, I still think Obamacare, which was in a lot of ways just a really bad and disappointing bill that was counterproductive and hurt Obama politically and didn't help the country that much, it nevertheless had a kind of ambition, that a structural ambition to say, okay, we're going to wrestle with maybe the number one the number one part of
Right.
America's fundamental economic unfairness, and we're going to try to get to universal health care. We're going to do it in this sort of ass backward way that combines a lot of Medicare spending, Medicaid spending, with these not very well functioning, expense, not sort of expensive private markets. But it was still sort of, it had that reach and it did have that sort of permanence. Whereas and it did develop some kind of a constituency such that when the Republicans tried to repeal it, they really couldn't. They got close, but they couldn't. And I don't sense that. I worry that in this sort of new progressive space, we don't have a single thing to hang our hat on that is like that. And
You
so
don't
the,
think
the question for me is, do these
right.
wins, what are they adding up to or building towards? Because the problems, as Tyler was saying, are pretty fundamental. The problem of inequality in this country, the problem of the lack of a sort of basic social democratic seat floor that almost every other rich country in the world has. Those are huge political, I think primarily political problems that for a long time have been held back by not just Republican obstructionism, but Democratic ambivalence, if not hostility. And are we making progress on that social democratic floor? I mean, I think if I could be convinced that we were, I'd probably shut up about a lot of this other stuff. But I'm not fundamentally convinced that we're doing it. And at the same time, we're hemorrhaging working class voters. We're narrowing our support. We're not, and we're losing the left sense of any kind of distinction from the sort of progressive Democrats. And we're not even making, and then this was the lens of the piece, we're not making real progress, in my view, on foreign policy pressure either. The
Well,
Gaza
yeah.
thing was such a wake-up call to me about where the Democrats are on, maybe it's just this one issue that doesn't actually speak for everything else. It's just this particular Israel blindness of the Democratic Party. But to me, it also spoke to this, like, just this unreachability of this party when it comes to something that they really feel they care about. And that to me is not predicated on some sort of popular tidal wave of support for sending infinite arms to Israel, but is clearly something within the political class. And I just fear that kind of unreachability would apply to all sorts of other
Mhm.
really important sort of objectives that I'd want, like that social democratic floor.
I mean, that's an excellent question. Actually, Tyler, I'm curious to know what you think about it, whether you feel like Gaza is an exception or if it is indicative of a, perhaps a immutability or at least a sort of, I don't know, inflexibility within the party if you want to bring up something that's actually hard, right?
Yeah,
Like, yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
That's
Tyler,
Yeah.
what do
helpful.
you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't. I mean, this is something people never like when I say it, but I don't think it just extends to Gaza. I mean, I think my academic research is on the history of the idea of human extinction, how our concerns about those risks have changed in response to new technologies. And a thing I worry a lot about is, resurgent nuclear proliferation, tensions in Eastern Europe with Russia. And the left isn't even talking about that. Like, I do get the argument for sending arms to Ukraine. I hope they prevail in their struggle, but there are like real nuclear risks that get swept under the rug and that the left used to care about. And I feel like there's just not a lot of discussion about that in the same way that there is with Gaza, right? Like, I'm fine if you want to say we should, support Ukraine and be sending arms, but I think we should have a frank discussion of the kind we used to have in the 80s about like what are some of the potential negative externalities. And so because of that, I don't see this Gaza issue as isolated. I think the Democratic Party and then some of the sort of leftward leaning elements of the Democratic Party are on foreign policy stuff still really conservative and do not seem to be willing to ask hard questions or even entertain questions, let alone mobilize to sort of think differently about how the US understands its strategic interests. So yeah, I mean, I think I do have I think I have more optimism about domestic policy that those obstacles aren't as deeply
Yeah.
entrenched. But it's something I worry about, and I don't think it's just a Gaza thing.
Yeah, I think it is most in other part because, I think that domestic policy is going to be a much bigger priority for people, for voters, and so it's going to feel more pressing. I mean, the big, kind of political science polling debate is okay, it does seem like a very like a not a significant majority of people disapprove of what Netanyahu is doing at the very least, right?
Yeah.
And that the U.S. should change its policy. And yet, the priority that they place that issue on is quite low, across the board. And so, it's like, it's like, well, how much do voters actually care about this? And how is that reflected amongst the political class that only looks at polls like that and makes decisions, right?
Whereas the sort of the elite actors who are really significant in places, I think particularly, hopefully this doesn't make me sound conspiracist or something, but in the media, it's obvious just watching the coverage of those protests. The sort of elite actors, it's not number 12 on their list.
Right.
It's actually probably number 3 or 1 for a lot of them. And that you'd have to walk through a fire, a media frenzy and fire, which we saw in the UK with Corbyn and so on. I think it would come home to any liberal, progressive, left wing politician who really took a strong stance today, and it would impact. Given how the media torpedoed Biden after Afghanistan, you can imagine them doing that,
Right.
and
Yep.
so I don't actually think it's just some sort of malicious or purely ideological thing for the Democrats on on Israel and Gaza. I think some of them probably do have more humane instincts. Probably Harris is one of them, I would guess.
Mhm.
But there's a real fear to what the consequences would be because of this elite opposition. And that's why I partly do translate that to some of the harder things. Jay, I like that point, that analogy in domestic politics. Because I think, yeah, you can do the child tax credit, you can do that. And that's great. And by the way, I don't think it's trivial, and it would be great to have that. Parental leave, even potentially, and they put Medicare for dental in the platform now. That would be great. So inching along on all these things, like that's great. I'm not like sitting here saying, oh yeah, let's stop doing that and do the cart path of just yelling at everybody and crying and hoping for another Bernie. Like obviously we should be trying to get those wins. But I think we also need to step back, thinking from within the left for a minute, and say, okay, but what is our relationship between those wins and the sort of larger struggle of actually, say, getting Medicare, even getting the Medicare age down from 65 to 60, which to me would be a bigger win, because it would point towards more directly towards a larger transformation. That seems to be off the table. And I do feel like whenever you really push against something really hard on a economic distribution level, when you have to like tax people making under $400,000 a year, which would clearly be necessary to create that social democratic floor, you run into, or raise the taxes on elites by an even more, by an even greater, sort of order of magnitude, you would run into that kind of sort of same Israel-Gaza kind of hard opposition among those elites. And when your party is the party of elites, as Tyler says, it's really hard to, you're in the hot dog suit saying, I'm trying to find the guy who did this, and that's what I fear for the sort of the fully sort of professionalized Democratic Party, that it's going to be unable to sort of serve the working class because it is not the working class, and it's going to try to find its way around all of these issues rather than sort of bearing the burden. If you had a working class coalition that I think broadly would be that could actually buck elite media, elite party insiders on certain key issues, I think then you're not in hock to them in the same way on a number of fronts.
Yeah, it's I think about it in terms of what's going to happen post-Trump too, right, to the Republican side, because they're going to also have a movement, or they're going to have a moment just like the left did, where they're like, well, we don't have this guy to rally around anymore. What are we going to do? And then how much of it is really going to be this fake populism that Trump at least can at least communicate that quite well. And if you don't, like, you can say he lies, but like the people believe it. Like the voting numbers are the voting numbers, right?
He embodies it, somehow.
Right. And then you can say that JD Vance is the heir to that, but I don't think JD Vance is the heir to that.
No.
He's
well,
awful.
I mean, he's actually I think it's revealing though, because I was a little scared not having ever seen him speak. I was a little worried just programmatically that he was an heir to that, which I think is a potentially dangerous, or at least like powerful political formation. But no, he just doesn't have it. I think clearly
I don't think he has it.
Yeah.
No.
So is it going to be like Tucker, for example, right? Is it going to? But I guess my point is just that there is a scenario where neither party thinks about the working class at all, right? And then that seems to open up an opportunity. And I wonder if that is when some people, very very conscious voting people, are just like, well, if we just take 3% of what Trump got from the white working class, for example, then we'll win every election forever. Like, that's the type of pivot that I can see them making post-Trump. But I don't know what form it'll take. I don't know what it'll look like. I think that the sort of magical moment of that day where, I mean, I feel like this is like, it's like, I feel almost embarrassed saying it, because I feel like I should be in one of these coffee shops down the hill in Berkeley, talking about the 60s, like all these old dudes do. They're like, oh man, the free, the free speech party,
Freedom
that
Summer.
was amazing. Do you remember what we did when, like when we defended People's Park against Reagan? But, the nice thing about that moment is that it came with a type of visual iconography that allowed you to imagine what it would look like. It would be people in hotels, hotel workers, for example, mostly Latino in Nevada, lining up to caucus for Bernie, right? Like, that was sort of the vision of it that came out. And it's like, it makes me emotional just thinking about it right now. And, but I don't know what that vision for the post-Trump, attempt to regain some of the working class thing is, because I can tell you what, the establishment Republicans like Nikki Haley or whoever is going to be the future of this thing post-Trump, they're not going to give a shit about this,
Well,
like they're not going to in mention it.
Yeah, I don't know if Tyler, you wanted to get in, but I can give you an optimistic and pessimistic case on this. Because in a funny way, the optimist is really wants to say that Trump, class de-alignment in America has been in warp drive since Trump came in. Yes, American politics has had the same complexion as industrialized politics everywhere in the world, blah, blah, blah. Like you do see, as unions decline, there are all sorts of big structural forces why the traditional working class has not felt that parties of the left center are its natural home anymore, and that those loyalties have atrophied everywhere. But in the US, it's gone insane in the last 10 years, 10, 12 years, since 2012, essentially since the arrival of Trump in particular. And the optimistic case, in a funny way, if you're especially if you're trying to do progressive democratic politics, the kind that I've been critiquing, is that you don't get Vance, you don't even get Haley necessarily. That's probably too optimistic, but you get like Ron DeSantis, right? Who tries to do some of the populism, but only in the most like sort of vague cultural way, but basically offers none of the economic goodies that somebody like Vance would want, and none of the sort of raw, you know, fuck it up kind of vibe that Trump offers, which is, you know, his most powerful weapon, and also much less kind of flexibility on things like, you know, ending the Republican war on Social Security and Medicare and so on. Like Ron DeSantis is going to go full steam ahead on all of those traditional Republican business class kind of objectives. And if you have a kind of a depopularized Republican Party, maybe that is an opening. I don't think it's an opening for a third party, Jay. It's just sad but true. We just don't have that institutional window right now, the way the party systems work. But maybe that is an opening for a more progressive, class conscious Democratic Party to kind of recoup some of those gains. The pessimistic case, though, is that the coalition, the Republican coalition, is different now. And maybe JD Vance isn't the answer, but you're going to have a more charismatic version of that is going to actually continue the fuck it up vibes. And how one way or another, that person is going to emerge through the party. We don't know who it is, whether it's a Tucker or some outsider, some celebrity, some unknown. And then that person is just going to be an actual, you know, is going to weaponize that kind of right-wing populism way more effectively. I mean, I think we may have lucked out with someone like Vance, who's like, he's basically too Yale in the end for this job. He's so obviously an elite pretending to be anti-elite that it's like he becomes the Republican Buttigieg, and it's not, none of it works. But there are authentic right populists out there. There really are. And it shouldn't be that hard for them to find one.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're getting at something with your pessimistic case. It's been something I've been worried about really since 2017 or 2018. I mean, Tucker Carlson's someone I pay attention to, and he's become much more critical of the free market and, you know, even critical of capitalism really openly in the last 5 years. And people don't realize this, but, you know, in the American context, we have a long tradition of capitalism agnostic and even anti-capitalist conservatism from before the pre-war era. There's like a long strain on the right of people who correctly recognize that, you know, capitalism melts everything solid to air and, you know, profanes everything that's holy and, you know, dissolves traditional family bonds and local ties and everything else. And I think Vance represents an attempt, at least rhetorically, to resurrect some of that without any substance to it, you know. But I do think, you know, there are, like you said, real right-wing populists. And I think a Republican Party that is, you know, straightforwardly pro-worker, anti-free market, that has a substantive break with neoliberalism while being wedded to traditionalist cultural politics, I think is a very formidable opponent for the left. And I think it's easy for me to imagine getting outflanked by that kind of. Whether we'll get it, I mean, I think is an open question. The, you know, Republicans are just as beholden to their donor class as the Democrats are. And so there are a lot of, you know, go ahead, Jay.
I think that if that person was I think that person would have, I agree with all of this in theory. And then because I do think about this question quite a bit. And then I just think, okay, then why hasn't that person emerged yet? There's many reasons why they haven't emerged yet, right? But why is it that when they try and do this, they always pick somebody like Vance or somebody like Blake Masters, who is a freak, you know, like a Stanford dude? Like, you want to talk about weird? Like, Blake Masters is fucking weird, right? And that the actual vision of this is not somebody who can speak in terms of anti-capitalism or whatever, but that when you have an actual populist from one of these places, they're almost always going to be like more like Marjorie Taylor Greene, where it's hard to, you know, like even like the party is not all one thing, right? Like there are a lot of rich dudes who vote Republican, and it's kind of like dudes who drive, I don't know, they like own car dealerships or whatever, right? Like this sort of bourgeois. I forget what Mike Davis's term was, right? But he talked about how the actual soul of the Republican Party are people who own like nursing home chains and car dealerships, right? Like these people who are
The
petty
local
billionaires,
magnates, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right. That
Petty
they're not
billionaires.
going to accept somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? And I don't know. I think it's an odd outcome that it's always this kind of like uncharismatic, uncharming Groyper types, right? Or it's always people who went to Yale. Like Josh Hawley is same exact thing as JD Vance. I think they were at Yale Law School together, right? Ron DeSantis went to Yale too. Like they all went to Yale. So I think that maybe that at this point it is a feature of this type of thinking that it's going to produce that type of person, and then that limits its power to me. But Tucker, who is from San Francisco and obviously is made his name wearing a bow tie, trying to do a William F. Buckley impersonation all the time, certainly is no like dyed in the wool truck driving
Yeah.
populist. But I do think he's probably the closest that we have to somebody who can make a coherent argument, who is not like who does appeal to some of these voters. And so I think maybe it'll just be him, right? Like maybe
Mhm.
the answer is just like, well, actually, it's just Tucker.
I mean, yeah. No, go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I don't know. I was just going to riff on this, but I didn't have anything clear in mind. Tyler, if you had something.
No. I mean, I think you're totally right, and I think Jay, you're right that it will probably just be Tucker. I think it's like it seems like he's been sort of moving and shaking with an eye to sort of taking over that kind of Trump mantle when Trump is out of the picture. I mean, I think the flip side on the left, and what I think a lot of this hinges to for me is like the professional class, right? Because you are right, like the soul of the Republican Party is these like small time Wendy's franchise owner guys, right, who are like petty millionaires. But I think the soul of the Democratic Party, or like at least an important part of its base, is this sort of the professional class and the PMC. And I think the dynamic that's interesting to me is what happens as the PMC continues to get more proletarianized, where like everyone's jobs are getting more precarious. I mean, it seems like the Democrats have actually done a good job with things like removing non-competes with Lena Khan. That's like a huge, I mean, that's a real problem for a lot of professional class people who are trapped
Oh
in
man,
jobs that
it like legitimately improved my life.
yeah. Like that's huge. And so like I
Yeah.
think the question for me is, can the Democrats make the case not just to the working class but also to the professional class that like actually you are more proletarianized and trending toward the working class than you realize. I mean, a lot of these corporations, I mean, even like big law jobs, etc., like everything is paying less than it used to. Everything is more precarious. My wife works in tech jobs are really precarious even when they pay well, and so I think the question I have on the flip side is like, are there ways that the Democratic Party can actually like form a coalition of PMC people and working class people based on a shared sense that actually the economy is really precarious? I mean, this is something you've pointed out before, Jay, but like there are always those articles that are like, a household income of $400,000 a year and living paycheck to paycheck. And, you've pointed out people sneer at those people, but there's like actually a real sense of precarity in a lot of, big cities, et cetera, that like where people really do have a hard time making ends meet despite having respectable, professional class salaries, particularly if they have, larger families. So I think there's room to try to make that case, but it's not clear to me strategically if
Do you
they're
think
gonna.
that's the case that Kamala is making right now though? Isn't that kind of similar, right?
I
I
think
think
so,
So,
but I don't think she's like
yeah,
articulated it.
right,
Like, sure, there's a lot of talk about the middle class, but in this like
right.
really amorphous kind of like we want to lump everyone into the middle class, like the PMC and the working class, which is calling everyone middle
well,
class,
right.
which is kind of a
Right.
euphemism for not rich. But like, I
I'm
There
think
not
we
was
need
a
to
sure
talk.
what.
whole
Yeah,
there was a whole series of videos about Kamala's own, and I think AOC herself sort of invoked Kamala as a working class, having a working
Oh
class
yeah, yeah.
background.
yeah.
That one
And I was
hurt
like,
me.
I mean, I know her parents split, and
They both have
she
Wikipedia
lived
pages.
in an apartment. But I was like, this means that my kids are working class because her parents
Yeah,
were like fancy academics. And then it was kind of amazing in the video. They went, jump cut from working class rental apartment. They did this. It wasn't always easy. And then it was like, first story was the first kind of anecdote was like, took place at like the Berkshire Hedge School or something like that, where she was in kindergarten. It was like, I looked at, it's an elite. I mean, maybe it was a different school back then, but the point is, it's a fucking private school. And like, you're not going to kindergarten at a private school if you're working class and you don't have some sort of middle class resources. So there is this, and I'm not class policing anyone here because, I'm all about the 99%. That's fine. I'm not trying to, but I do think that there's a murkiness about what they do. And here's the reason why I fear here, just to go back to pessimism, since we're leaning towards optimism too much here. I worry that they do, when the Democrats do this sort of populist thing, or they even speak on terms of centering the economy and centering precarity, and like, here we're actually who's the party that's going to spend. They do it in this way that's so hyper partisanized that it doesn't actually break out of these increasingly hermetic red and blue bubbles. So anyone who's kind of already, for whatever biographical, cultural, geographic reason, on team red or in the sort of red purple universe, whether it's because they're an exurban, they live in the exurbs, or they like this kind of music or whatever the hell, they don't see themselves as part of this team because it's continually as beamed out. The DNC is maybe an extreme case, but I think in general, when Democrats sort of beam out their economic agenda, it's all run through the lines of, well, yeah, we are, it's about sort of making a complete equality between the Democratic Party and the sort of economically disempowered, which is, so patently untrue that it grates on people's ears to say. And then at the same time, it's like Donald Trump and his Wall Street friends. What that move is, I don't want to like over dramatize that, but that is such a classic Democratic move. And yes, it's better than not talking about corporate greed or not talking about Wall Street. Yeah. But it's so fundamentally different from the Bernie move because it takes a class conflict and it turns it into a partisan conflict. And therefore, I think it deprives it of 97% of its power to be scientifically precise, because it actually just makes it a same old reinforcing blue versus red culture war kind of universe. You like this kind of ice cream, I like that kind of ice cream kind of energy that actually makes it sort of is trying to bring in class politics as almost like an enhancement of that culture war of that fundamental culture war politics. And I'm not talking about sex and gender stuff even. I'm talking about the sort of almost the deepest identity politics in America today, which is the partisan identity politics. And it's right. Build out of that frame, I think falls dead on arrival as a kind of genuine populism or a genuine attempt to sort of reform class coalitions. And that's why I'm really skeptical, unless there's some big shifts in how the parties operate, that this general trend is going to continue. I mean, I'm almost certain it is. Kamala is probably going to halt the bleeding a little bit with African-American voters. I think that's which is significant because that was like a big part of the bleeding. And maybe with Latino voters to some extent. But I think broadly,
and young voters too. I mean, she's doing way better with young voters.
Broadly, voters without college degrees, I think, are going to be more Republican still on the whole than they were in 2020.
Right.
And that is just going to. I don't know how. I don't think you can break out of that education class logjam through a purely partisan rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think that. It is funny because Kamala and I grew up basically very similarly. Like I mean, my parents weren't professors, but certainly immigrants who came to the United States to pursue graduate degrees in very prestigious institutions and prestigious university towns. That's how I lived in student housing in a series of apartments as a child. I guess I am working class by the definition too. I'm just like, cool.
Yeah, great.
I didn't know. I always just thought I was middle class.
Jay, I've always seen you as a kind of a lunch pail New Yorker writer. You don't want the name on the back of your jersey. You just show up and do the work, man. No salt. When you get the answer, you hand the ball back to the referee.
Right. I had a question, which for both of you, which is a little bit out of field, but it's something I personally have been thinking about, which is just that you mentioned identity politics and how the biggest identity politics is partisan. I absolutely believe that. And,
Yep.
it's just highlighted by every time I open social media, I'm getting screamed at by the most crazy people. I mean, there are people, I never want to talk about my Twitter experience on this show, but man, this morning there are like people posting like quoting Richard Nixon and saying the press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. And I'm just like, you people are crazy. Like you're like, like you're doing this from the behalf of of Democrats. And, but how do you think that all of this is functioning? Because I have this theory that I think that the identity part of Kamala Harris is actually quite a big deal in terms of the way in which she has surged in the polls a little bit and why people are so excited about her.
You mean the
And
racial
it was
identity part or the
no, her being a woman, her being a black woman specifically. I don't think the South Asian part has much, I don't know. I don't think it really has. There's not that many South Asian people in America. And she certainly identifies more as a black woman. But I think that basically it really struck me watching Hillary last night do the stuff that she did in 2016, right? Talk about women specifically, that women are very excited, and women I know in my own life, right? Really, really excited about Kamala Harris in ways that I, as a dude did not expect, I'll admit. And I do think that there is something about her specific identity mix, right? And the fact that she never really talks about it, that is giving people license to be even more excited about it. And it's this weird, it's not a contradiction really, right? It actually makes sense. It's just that you have these white women, mostly, right? I'm talking about here, who really want to vote for a black woman and a woman generally, right? These are liberal voters. And their enthusiasm for Kamala Harris is like through the roof because of that. And they kind of don't want Kamala Harris to talk about it all the time, right? Because they think that then they start to worry about like, oh, well, what about like this dude and, this like random guy that I don't even know, but I'm theorizing about in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, right? Is he going to be turned off if Kamala starts talking about how she's a woman and how she's black? And so in that way, she like occupies this amazing role in identity politics where never talking about it, but still after Peggy Noonan put it this, Peggy Noonan, the Wall Street Journal columnist, wrote a column about this, and she was talking about how like, I think she called it about the redemption of the pantsuit brigade or something like that, in a sort of typically kind of funny Peggy Noonan fashion where you're just like, all right, that was a good line. But I think I think that's all happening, I think that's a large part of it. And it's something that's strange because it's never discussed. And the reason it's never discussed is because Kamala never talks about it, she doesn't.
I'd like to hear Tyler on this, but just quickly, parenthetically on Peggy Noonan, I think it was that Peggy Noonan piece where she also maybe talked about Kamala's like physical attractiveness.
Yeah.
Trump, and he just can't shut up about how beautiful Kamala is according to Peggy Noonan, and even to the point of being like, she's a beautiful woman, and then just like trailing off like for almost the Joe Biden amount of time before he picked up his train of thought. So well done by Peggy Noonan, because she really brought it home. Yeah.
She really messed his head up.
Yeah.
And also that was another good line that she had in there. She said the camera can't find a bad picture of her, which I think is true,
100%. Yeah.
Anyway, Tyler, go ahead.
No, I think that's totally correct. Actually, Jay, we had I got a fan message the other day from somebody that was like, you have to talk on the show about how Kamala is hot. Like, I feel like this is really important. And I was like, I don't know if that's exactly our wheelhouse, but it is nonetheless true. And I think it's like part of it. But I think you're right about Jay, this like identity loophole that she finds herself in. I mean, I think, we were hearing all of this claptrap before the. It's partly because of the Obama white lash theory, which I do not subscribe to. The idea that we got Trump as a backlash against the first black president. And I don't subscribe to it because A, it totally discounts any of Obama's policy failures, but B, does not explain how so many working class white voters who voted for Obama suddenly contracted racism. And, but I do think, we've had a lot of rhetoric that, Americans wouldn't elect a black woman because of misogyny and racism, et cetera. And we were seeing that's really not true. And I hope it causes a reevaluation of that claim. That's not to say I think she'll win, but it is to say that like her poll numbers are going up. She is seems to have increasing support, certainly much better than Joe Biden. But the thing that I think is interesting about the identity loophole you're pointing out, where people are excited to vote for a Black woman, even as she's not making that the center of her campaign, I think there's an extent to which people, I'm sure you both have noticed, they're resuscitating the Democrats. A lot of sort of traditional American rhetoric around like freedom is coming up a ton. Patriotism was a huge leitmotif of the DNC, and I think there's a way in which, people are optimistic. And even as they recognize that America has tons of problems and wealth inequality and so on, that like nonetheless, there is something amazing about, a person of color born to immigrant parents, in middle class, certainly professional class, but middle class origins, working their way up through, personal success. And I think there's something about that people still really admire. It's one of these like old American myths that we love, even as we know it's not entirely true, And I think she's leaning into that a bit, where she's like trying to make it about her merits. And I think reasonable people can argue about her political trajectory and, where she's had missteps and where she hasn't. But I kind of think that is part of the appeal, that she does speak to this kind of mythos that in America, out groups can become in groups. And that, like I said, doesn't mean it's true, but I think that's part of what some of the excitement is. I mean, she's exuding optimism as a candidate, but I also think the fact that she is a candidate also speaks to our ability to have that kind of optimism,
Yeah, putting aside my sort of, the class critique and my, kind of semi-private melancholy about the state of the left and my skepticism about, Harris as, a vector of, I think the Times, Tim Schenck had an op-ed in the Times, like Kamala Harris has a chance to to transform the Democratic Party. And I love Tim. I love his historical work and his commentary, but I'm like, no, she doesn't. She just doesn't. That's not true.
Yeah.
She has a chance to win the election and be better than Trump and do a few good things, but she doesn't have a chance to transform it. Anyway,
totally.
I would that it were so, but none of that prevents me from being coconut pilled, because I did completely see in a flash, like probably alongside everybody else, broadly of my persuasion, who had gone from a position of sort of deep skepticism about her as this kind of remembering her 2020 run, remembering how mixed up and confused everything seemed to be in her campaign, and her hitting all the wrong notes and kind of seeming phony, to realizing that actually as a political personality, she is so profoundly comfortable in her own skin that is so unlike, well, Hillary Clinton, but unlike so many other Democratic politicians that you see even in the 5-minute segments where they go up on stage and you can see them just trying to be something else. And and I do think that if you want to call that attractiveness, it's a huge component of it classically, right? Is that kind of self-comfort and that laugh. I do think, and Jay, I know this has frustrated you, and this is your frustration has brought on the ire of blue MAGA, et cetera. But I do sort of think it's smart for her to be as vague as possible.
Yeah.
If I were her, I would not be going into policy, programmatic, ideological detail. I would be about vibes, because the vibe contrast between her and Trump is the strongest possible contrast she could have. And she does make him seem like a sour, old, sick man. Not a fascist, but just a sour, sick, old, grouchy man. And he just brings you down. And yeah, I think up beats down. If you look at that's just look at the last 20 presidential elections, and up has beaten down every time.
Right.
Pretty much. And I think on a purely tactical electoral level, I think, she surprised me, but it makes sense now.
Yeah. This is a total. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jay.
I do think, just to clarify, I agree electoral strategy wise, she should do what she's doing. My point was just that, look, reporters have a job and they should do their job, and they should inform the public a bit better. But in terms of like what's going to win the election, I don't think that Kamala Harris explaining what she wants to do with Lena Khan and what her stance is on antitrust is going to move. I don't know. Maybe Matt Stoller will disagree with me, but I don't think that that's going to move that many voters. I think that in the end, and for me, it does go a little bit further than that, which is, this is like the stupidest, most lib thing to say, but I do have a daughter, and I do think it would be cool if there's a woman president.
Yeah.
I think it would be sick, right? Like it would be very, very, very cool. And is that enough for me to kind of sweep a lot of other stuff under the rug? It actually is, despite what Blue Mag is saying about me. Like, I don't like, I think it's important. I thought it would have been important I really didn't like Hillary Clinton, right? Like, I like Kamala Harris way more than Hillary Clinton. But even with Hillary, I was just like, yeah, it'd be cool if, first of all, I was just like, this Trump guy, absolutely not, But the second thing was just like, well, it would be cool. And I think a lot of people feel that way, but they just don't. Like, we've reached this point in the discourse where people don't discuss things that way. And it happened very quickly. And that phenomenon is almost more interesting than the fact that people are doing identity politics without talking about it. It's just how quickly we went for this moment in 2020 where that was the only thing that people talked about, to being this to 2024 where, like, it seems déclassé and risky to talk about it at all, right? And I think that's reflected in the way that it's discussed. I
felt like Matt, Trump was trying to get her to talk about it by like Trump is trying to do
he's trying to
fight the
Lotta or whatever, all that shit. He wants them to go and sort of run a Stacey Abrams type campaign where, and I don't talk about Georgia, but I mean the way that you were talking about it, Jay, reminded me of how a lot of people felt about Stacey Abrams as this kind of sort of, slightly magical, transcendent figure, largely due to her identity. And I think Trump kind of would love to see Kamala do that. But yeah, she hasn't taken the bait so far.
Yeah, it's been an amazingly well-run campaign. I feel like I should say that. Because it's just, and also the transformation. I don't know. Bhaskar said she's like Andrew Wiggins, right? Which is, I thought was so funny because, Andrew Wiggins was this guy who's #1 pick. And then he had a disappointing career, was always like not quite reaching his potential. And then he went to the Warriors. And once he was on like a championship team, he turned into one of the best players in the league. And I was like, it kind of is like that, where you're just like, where was all of this? Was it just that the context wasn't big enough for you? Because, I don't know, she basically almost lost every single race that she ran.
No,
right?
She never won a competitive, district. She's never spoken to a swing voter in her life, et cetera. She's like never been. And that was the sort of laundry list of why she was an absolute no-go, and I was all about the contested convention and blah blah blah. But obviously, that was wrong from a pure.
That's totally wrong.
Totally,
That was a disastrous recommendation. So yeah.
Yeah, can you imagine if like Pete had won that, and then
no.
there's this like, there really is this like energy around her. I do think to address the read or the listener of Tyler who messaged you, I do think some of it comes from the fact that just because we are humans, that she is like incredibly good looking. It's just like she just exudes this type of health and strength. And then you look at Biden and you're just like, oh man, like, is he gonna make it? Or you look at Trump and like everything is fucked up, right? His hair is fucked up, everything is like fucked up about
orange,
him.
President
and then you have this other side where you have this like very attractive, healthy, vital looking person giving speeches, and you're just like, of course people are gonna be drawn to that, especially since they don't really know that much else about her. And I don't know. I would say that it's all. Here's the last question I have.
Jay,
go ahead.
Can President Babe reverse class de-alignment? That's the question.
It's also a question of it's also a question of AOC, right? Like, I mean, with AOC, it's like it's the same thing. Where I don't know. I feel like I was given permission to do this by Molly Ball, who wrote the Nancy Pelosi biography, and the first chapter or the introduction is a lot about what Nancy Pelosi wore, and Molly Ball is like, I know that I'm not supposed to do this, but it is part of what they do, so I'm going to just do it. So I feel like AOC definitely had a different look last night, didn't you think? Like, she wore like much darker clothes. It seemed like she like was presenting herself in a very sort of serious type of way, which I found to be interesting. I don't want to fixate on too much because at some point there'll be 3 dudes talking about AOC, So the last question I had, and this is the thing I think about by far the most about all of this, and man, I'm glad you're on because I think you probably think about it too, which is that the one thing I will say about the surge these days in terms of the consolidation of Democrats and the excitement that they feel is that I wonder if it will lead to a certain winning type of mentality that will, by its definition, be quite hostile to the left. And the place where I see this the most is that the way in which people talk about protesters about Gaza, right? And that I think there is a real hardening about this where people who might have been sympathetic to them even 4 months ago now are just like, fuck them. They're going to get in our way, right? Like, how dare you? And I saw it was, look, I don't think it matters, but Stephen King is a prominent figure. Stephen King wore a t-shirt and put it on Twitter where it was like the Shepard Fairey Kamala print, and underneath it said, "I'm speaking," which was evoking the moment where Kamala shut down protesters in Michigan. And I found that to be so dispiriting because I thought about it and I was like, of all the things that this woman could possibly represent to you, the first woman president, the first Black woman president, somebody who, I don't know, believe whatever, the child of immigrants, which is important to me, like you choose this moment where she shuts down these protesters, right, who are protesting what's happening in Gaza. That's the most like titillating moment to you. Like, what the fuck is wrong with you? And I think but I think what he's doing is reflective of some sort of intolerance to the left that might be forming, and that this triumphalism might end up being quite harmful to a lot of the people. I don't think it'll be harmful to AOC. I don't think it'll be harmful for economic issues, but I do think maybe it'll be harmful for people who, for example, are, people who protest, right? For anything, right? Even like anti-police protesters, whatever, right? Like, I just think that it'll be harmful for a lot of the weaker organizations on the left. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, let me say, fuck you, Stephen King. I'm speaking. All right. I'm on the Say Goodbye podcast and I'm speaking right now. No, I mean, I do think that energy is there. I mean, we saw it hard. We saw how, broadly the university administrations, not everyone, but most of them, and then even more so elite media responded to the protests at the time. I would actually say, Jay, I feel like what's happened is a little different than that. I mean, what you're saying isn't wrong, but I think the almost more powerful trend is the diminution of a lot of the protest energy. I mean, we were there in May. It seemed undeniable that Chicago was going to be 68 again,
right?
And it's just, I don't know. Maybe it still will be, but I think that I read something about how they're only about a quarter of the number of protesters they were expecting. DNC is obviously very well prepared. And a lot of the sort of uncommitted movement, like its greatest triumph was essentially having a seminar somewhere in the hotel complex about Palestine. But, AOC, had 7 minutes at the convention, didn't make a protest point even once, didn't even sort of artfully fold it into, and here's why you have to support Harris anyway. Just simply patted Harris on the back and let it go.
Warnock did a little bit, but yeah,
a little
you're
bit.
right. You are right. You are right that was it.
But broadly, it turns out, I think so. I read somebody say, and I think it's a fair summation, that a lot of that protest energy outside of, say, the actual people in the encampments was, displaced anti-Biden energy, and getting Biden out is kind of enough to, I mean, it's been very strange to me to see on the left people who were very excited about, riding with Joe until October of 2023, then turned on, the genocidaire in chief, and then now are back to being coconut pilled with Harris. And that's like a non-trivial faction of people who I don't think are silly people fundamentally, but this is where their politics are. And so I actually sort of think, I'm not sure if it's going to mean more crackdowns on protests, although probably it will if there's an attempt to do something in the fall. But I actually just think that maybe the state of the sort of a bit of a sort of a limbo in Gaza itself right now, a punctuated equilibrium of violence is kind of not generating the same kind of momentum. And then there's this fear of the regional war and blah, 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 all this other stuff that kind of gets in the way of the sort of the nakedness of the moral horror that's happened there. And so I'm not expecting a hot protest summer or a kind of this to be on the agenda at all in the next 3 months. Of course, that can change, and it, probably we should bet on it to change given the way the Middle East is, that there will be some more news from the region. But it seems to me that the air has kind of come out of that balloon a little bit, for better or for worse, from my perspective, for worse. But it's not just because of the crackdown or because of a kind of anti-left sentiment on the part of, multimillionaire, fiction writers. but because it's actually internally.
I'm not a multimillionaire, nor am I a fiction writer.
No, Stephen King.
Oh,
Stephen
you're talking about Stephen
Yeah.
King. Okay.
No, it's not just
I did write a novel.
It's not just a lot of punch. I'm sorry, Jay. I'm sorry.
No.
I'm
Right under
looking
the
at it
bus.
right now. But I just think that it's not just like sort of left hippie punching that's caused this. It's
Right.
Sort of the soft underbelly of the protest movement itself, if you will.
Right. I think that might be true. And but you guys are both on college campuses. Do you not? I can't tell. I will say that living, a 10-minute walk from one of the most famous protest, at least history, college campuses, I don't know. But do you not think that this will come back on college campuses starting in the fall? Like, you don't think it'll be a big issue again, or that the students will come back and do the exact same thing that they did last semester?
So I will say I teach at a liberal arts college, and there have been very few protests at liberal arts colleges for, I think, a bunch of institutional reasons related to size and also just like academic culture and stuff.
Yeah, Pomona was a big one, right?
Yeah. I do think, part of it, and I don't want to reduce college student to people who are just like excited to rabble rouse or anything like that, but I think part of it will depend too on the institutional response. Like Columbia's putting up fencing all over the campus, and I think a certain kind of student is going to be like, fuck you, like this is, you already called the cops on all my friends. Like I do think some of it is going to depend on what the on the ground circumstances look like at the universities themselves and how much they've prepared for. I think there's like a way in which if universities go in expecting big protests, they're going to find themselves getting them. And I think maybe ones that, I think ones that don't, maybe they will, maybe they won't, but I think like Matt said, the Middle East situation is volatile. I think it'll depend. I think it's very possible that, the protest movement will be ignited if there's like another really bad incident in Gaza amid the stream of the slow drip of really bad incidents.
Yeah. I also just think that there is the in the absence of that, the imperative of the presidential election is going to come home to people in a way that was simpler than if Biden were there. And I do think people, a lot of even the protesters are going to be, I know they're not protesting. They're not going to feel like they're protesting to help Trump, blah, 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 blah. But I do think that trickles down and gets into the mix. And I think it will probably soften some of the things as we get into the real, you're going to have, the election stuff, just if we think it's overdrive now, we're going to have more debates. We're going to have more head to heads. It's going to be, everybody's going to be freaking out at their laptops, checking the Nate Silver numbers and the needle and all this bullshit. There is that kind of, and these protests exist in the sort of the Republic of Blue broadly. And like people in that republic are like glued to their screens thinking about the election 24/7, including a lot of the protesters. And I think only a very tiny minority of them are genuinely indifferent to who wins that election. So I don't. It doesn't mean that they're not going to like do an encampment, but it does mean that it's going to shape how a lot of these decisions are made and play out in these next few months. So I don't think it's going to be it's likely to be a big story for the election.
It's very hard to keep protests going for that long too. Especially, if they can, obviously the divestment protests in the 80s and 90s were able to carry it over multiple years on college campuses, but and that is the model for these protests. But we live in that was 30 years ago, and it's pretty different now. And I think that if Columbia students go back and they occupy that quad again, and they are evicted forcefully by I don't know, I guess it's like some dude is an interim president and replace the Baroness, that if he does the Baroness, if he does the same stuff, then I think the other schools will copy that. But if Columbia, it's a strange thing where Columbia is really the center of all of this at this point. If they don't, then I don't think other schools will. Perhaps UCLA might. Those are the two schools that I think are in the deepest focus. But I guess I think that it would create a challenge for Harris in a way that she would actually have to take a stance on something, which, as you pointed out, Matt, it works for her not to, right? It kind of works for her to not do that. And it works for her to give that one response where she says, I'm speaking on one night, and then the next night give a much more respectful response when she's interrupted, right? And I do think that you are also right in saying that I think that the fact that she actually did that does kind of mollify some of the, or it does kind of blunt some of the anger that they might feel that they would have felt for Biden, because Biden would have said something way worse. I mean, I'm not sure Biden would actually know that he was being interrupted, to be completely honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An asshole. But he would have, his rhetoric was worse, right, than what Kamala has offered up so far. And in some ways, that's all we quite know, because the other stuff, like you said, feels completely inaccessible to change. And so it's really just like, can we get this person to say the right stuff? All right. Is there anything else we want to talk about? This was fun. I really enjoyed it. I feel it was actually quite clarifying for me in a lot of my confused thinking over the last few days, where I just sit in bed and stare at Twitter, and then I'm just like, I really need to delete this app from my phone.
No, seriously. I think
right.
Probably after the election, I'll do that for about a year at least. Yeah.
This morning I was arguing with Blue MAGA for an hour and a half. I looked up, I was like, it's been an hour and a half. I'm just arguing with these random accounts. What's wrong with me?
Jay, go work on your next novel.
Yeah, I know. Well, in my defense, I started at 5 a.m., and so by the time I was over, it was still quite early, but I was just like, man, what a weird use of time. I'm 44 years old. I really shouldn't be doing this. It's embarrassing.
Yeah, but Jay, the only people up that early are older folks often. So you were probably
but I'm on the West Coast. It's prime viewing for everybody else. Everyone who might ever want to employ me was just
Blue MAGA is bringing its freshest soldiers to combat with you at 5:30 in the morning. You can't handle the human wave attacks coming out of Bethesda. Amazing. And Upper Manhattan.
I know. Or here in Berkeley, California, it's like some other old people who got up with me, and they're just like, fuck this dude. I saw him down at the grocery store. He was really rude. They have I kind of respect the energy that they bring. It's like, I mean, I don't know. Obviously, we all lived through this with the Bernie Bro phenomenon, but it is just so toxic, where I'm just like, I can't believe you typed those words to me, what's wrong with you? I'm just this dude writing a little blog for this little outlet called The New Yorker. Please leave me alone.
Jay, we salute you for your service. It's like, as quote Harrison Butker quoting the Kansas City Chiefs place kicker, quoting Winston Churchill, a man who has not had enemies has never taken a brave stand. So
that is true. That is true. Nice. That is true. All right, we'll leave on that. Matt, thanks for coming on. Let's do this again. We had a great time. This will be out tomorrow.
Totally. Good seeing you guys.
Cheers.